There's a stark contrast in believing that God is out to get you or that he genuinely loves you. Jim, do you remember the hottest worship service that you and I have ever been in? Do you remember where that was? Cancun. Jim and I had the privilege of being on a mission project in Cancun. The praise team at that time, along with Justin and Alan, and I think Matt was playing the drums at that time, and we were worshiping in Cancun. And you might think, well, that ought to be a nice place to worship. And it was, because we were at a little resort. We were doing some work on some of the church buildings there and so forth. And that night it was going to rain. We were worshiping next to a swimming pool. We thought that was pretty cool. The pool was here. We had a blow-up screen. There were about 60 or 70 of us in that project. And we every night would worship outside, and it was kind of the breeze coming off of the ocean, and it was kind of a nice thing. And people in the swimming pool would swim up to the edge of the pool, and they were worshiping with us. And we just thought that was perfect until the rain came. And when the rain came, a local pastor said, "You're more than welcome to use my church building for tonight's worship service if you would like to do so." And we accepted. But what we didn't realize is that the church building was extremely small, probably smaller than the original church building here, just very, very tiny stage. And all the band members were kind of crumped together on one side of that stage. They couldn't move back and forth because they would knock each other off the stage if they did. And on that particular night, that building was filled to capacity, standing room only. It was just a packed house, and it had to have been 120 degrees inside that building. It was just as hot as I've ever had it be at a worship service. And myself and Mauricio, who was my interpreter that night, I preached hard. It was one of the hardest sermons I've ever preached, I think. I was drenched. I was just drenched with sweat. Mauricio was drenched with sweat. The band members were drenched with sweat. Everybody that was worshiping there was drenched in sweat. It stunk in that building by the time worship was over. Worship was over. We had a great night. People came to know Christ. It was just a wonderful experience. And as we're leaving the building, there were more people standing on the outside. And Mauricio says, "We got to do it again." I said, "What do you mean we got to do it again?" He says, "You got to preach again." "What do you mean I got to preach again? I can barely stand up right now." You got to preach again. These people came to hear the gospel, and they couldn't get inside the building, and they've waited on us on the outside. They need to know. And I preached again on the front porch of that church. I delivered the same sermon with the same enthusiasm as I did before. And Mauricio went back and forth. So many accepted Christ that night. It was a wonderful experience. Do you know there are some churches that would say, well, if they hadn't got here on time. Do you hear what I just said? There are some churches that would have said, our worship service begins at a certain time and it ends at a certain time. If they would have got here on time, then they would have been able to sit in the service and they would have heard the gospel. That's kind of uncertain for us, isn't it? Uncertainty for us. That just because somebody's not on time doesn't necessarily mean they should be left out. Listen to a parable that Jesus taught. Matthew chapter 20. I'm going to read the first 15 verses. "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard." Now, pause for a moment right there. A day's wage would have been a denarius. That would have been what you would have paid for a full day of work. That being the sun coming up to the sun going down, you would get paid one denarius. That was a fair wage. "And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give to you.' Didn't agree to a price, did he? So they went. And again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour. So he actually hired laborers 4 different times. And did the same thing. And about the 11th hour, the 5th time he goes out, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day long?' They said to him, because no one hired us. And he said to them, you go into the vineyard also. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call all the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. When those who hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. Now, underline that phrase there. You have made them equal to us. But he answered and said to one of them, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give to this last man the same as I to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So the last shall be first, and the first last. I want you to hear three things from this passage of Scripture that just jumped out at me when I began to look at these questions. The question that Jesus asked there that is so important is not so much, why are you still standing here idle? Why haven't you been working all day? That's one question. But the second question that he asked is more important. He said to those people, is it not lawful for me to do what I want with my money? Is it not my money to pay whatever I choose to pay to whoever it is? I can do whatever I choose with what is mine to give. The first thing I want you to hear is the call of the laborers. Listen how this call went out. There was an early morning call where this man, the laborer, was given a denarius to go in the field to work. He would have started as the sun was coming out, and he would have ended. He would have worked all day long, and when the sun was going down, he would have been paid a denarius. He promised a fair wage. What he promised him was not something less than he should have got. It was actually what he should have received. It's what a day would cost a laborer, a man to put labor in his field. The response of the laborers was that they were willing to do the work, that they had agreed to go into the fields, and that they would agree that they would do that at this particular rate. No one else that was hired that day was given a set figure. The rest of the people that came, the landowner said the same thing to him over and over again. I will give you what's right. He didn't say, I'll give you what you deserve. He didn't say, I'll give you prorated wages. He said, I will just give you what's right at the end of the day. And they trusted that that would happen, and so they went into the fields to work. My guess is that those guys that started working later in the day expected to get less than a denarius, because that would be what the practice would be. So each of them received a call or a hiring notice to go to work. None of them filled out an application. None of them went to the unemployment board and put their name there and had this guy come up and say, okay, I need some workers today. Can you give me X number of workers? What's the fair wage? None of that happened. It was a simple process of going out and finding people that were willing to work and giving them the invitation to work, and that he would reward them with a fair wage. The beginning of that parable, Jesus wants us to understand some things about who initiates the call to us to work in the vineyard. That it's not something that you and I apply for. It's not something that we negotiate a deal for. That when Jesus begins to call people to work in his field, let's talk about the salvation experience, he does that at his discretion. He does that in his timing. He may want to hire some of his people early in the morning. He may wait till the 11th hour to redeem somebody else. How many times have you ever heard this expression? Well, they waited to their deathbed to accept Jesus. And you say that as if that's not good. You understand what I mean by that? I baptized a 96-year-old woman one time. I was terrified. I baptized a lot of people, and I baptized big people, I baptized tall people, but nobody frightened me more than this 96-year-old woman. She was living in a recreational trailer, and when I say that, not a big fancy one. It was one of those little round things that you pulled behind a car sometimes. Had a bed, a little kitchen, and that was it. And her family did not care much for her, but I went to visit her one time, and sitting knee to knee in that little recreational vehicle, I had the opportunity to share faith with her and to share Christ with her. And she accepted Christ as her Lord and Savior that day. And then she said to me, now I want to be baptized. And I really honestly tried to talk her out of it. Little frail. I'm thinking, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do this or not. What if she has a heart attack? What if she's afraid of water? What if something breaks when I do this? You know, there was just all of this fear, but she was insisting, and so we baptized her. We got her in the water. I baptized her. That was one of the most glorious occasions in my life. I helped her out to the stairs. She went her way, and it wasn't but a few weeks thereafter that she died. And there were people on both sides of the issues. There were some people that said, well, she wasted her whole life and waited to the last minute to be baptized. And the thought behind that was, well, she's lived for the devil all of her life, and at the last minute, she got her insurance policy to get out of hell. You know, she knows that she only has a few more weeks or months or years to live. So at the last minute, she just kind of snuck into the kingdom. But there was another group of people who rejoiced at the fact that she found her way into the kingdom. That there was this rejoicing that took place because she found her place at the end result. Now, the story here is unfolding. Listen to what the compensation is for these guys. In verses 8 through 10, it says, I will pay their wages. I will pay some of them a denarius for a whole day's work. But the others of you, I will do what's right for you. The generosity of the landowner is, I'm going to give each of you equally the same thing. Why? Because I choose to do that. When we begin to judge between people's lives as to who deserves to be in the kingdom and who doesn't deserve to be in the kingdom, when we begin to look at God's grace, and sometimes, I'm just to be honest with you, God's grace is not seen upon very well by some church members. We always want people to go into a certain kind of mold. We want people to do a certain kind of thing, and we want people to act a certain kind of way. And if they don't do that, then there's something wrong with the grace that God gave to him. Jesus was not that thing. He said, I am going to challenge all of the social norms here. The social norm says, I will pay this man a denarius for a whole day's work, but this guy over here that worked 1 hour, I'm going to give him the equal amount that I'm giving this guy over here. Now, some of you right now are saying, well, that was unfair. Because we live in a capitalistic society where people only get what they deserve. Well, surely there should have been a time clock. Well, surely they should have taken that denarius and divided it out so that each person got paid fairly. We want to use that word a lot of time. Fairly, because they worked a certain number of hours. And so these people that worked all day long should not be given the same thing as the person that worked in the last minute. God's grace is not based upon what we deserve. God's grace is not dependent upon how much we do the work. God's grace is not dependent on how many hours we spend in the Christian faith. God's grace is dependent upon the fact that he is generous and gives it to us freely. Whether you work 20 hours a day or whether you work 30 minutes at the end of the day, God's grace is going to be sufficient, and it's because he chooses to give it to us. I like to give. It's one of the things that I enjoy doing. And I'm often criticized by who I give to and why I give to them. Why I give to them is because I believe sometimes the Spirit of God stirs inside of me and says, this is something that you need to do. This is something that you ought to do. This is something that I'm compelling you to do. And when I listen to that Spirit, I just choose to do it. And I don't make judgment calls upon whether somebody deserves that or doesn't deserve that. Do you understand me with that? I tip sometimes heavier than what normal people do because I choose to do that. And when people are sitting at the table says, why are you doing that? I get to say to them, it's my money. I get to do with what I want to. It's mine to give, and I can give it to who I please whenever I choose to do that. Well, it's not fair. Grace is not fair. Grace is not dependent upon our fairness. It's not dependent on whether we've earned it or deserved it. God's grace is insignificant if it becomes something that we deserve. God's grace is based upon the fact that God says, this is mine to give, and I will give it generously to whomever I choose to give it to. Well, what about that person that's waited to the very end of their life? Thank God for His grace. Well, what about that person that's lived their lives like this all their lives? They've been bad all of their lives, and now we're going to accept them into the church? Yes, we are. Why? Because God's grace. Well, what about these people that do bad things all the time and then come to church and want to be forgiven for it? Well, that's what we're all about, is it not? Isn't that what our gospel says to us? Isn't that what we preach to people? That no matter what you've done in your life, no matter how bad you've lived your life, even if you've waited to the last minute of your life, you've lived for the devil all of your life, but these last 30 minutes of your life, you choose to go into the labor with God, and God says, I will give you what I've given to the most faithful church member that's ever lived. I'm going to give you the same grace that I gave Billy Graham. I'm going to give you the same grace that I've given to my disciples. I'm going to give you the same grace that I have given to the Pope. I'm going to give you the same grace that I've given to Mother Teresa. I'm going to give you the exact same payment, the exact same thing, even though you have not earned it or deserve it. Sometimes we have a hard time with grace. Sometimes we prejudge people and we try to determine what is deserving for them and what's not. The man that, when I first went to First Baptist Walterboro, I hadn't been there but just a few weeks. And he would come and sit in the sanctuary by himself about 3 o'clock every afternoon. My understanding was that he always would pick up some grandchildren at school, but before he would go pick up the grandchildren, he would come to the church and sit in the sanctuary by himself. And several times I thought, okay, he just came to pray. I don't know who he is. He's just here to pray, and that's okay. And the habit became so regular that one day I finally asked the secretary, I said, who is that's sitting in the sanctuary? And she gave me a name. And she said, but we don't mess with him. I said, why don't we mess with him? We don't mess with him because he's mean. We don't mess with him because he's filed bankruptcy and he owes everybody money in town. We don't mess with him because he cusses and drinks a lot. We don't mess with him because he's just a mean man. Older man. So I felt like that was somebody that I should get to know. And so I went to the sanctuary one day and just sat next to him, and I introduced myself as the new pastor. And I said, I noticed you come and sit in the sanctuary day in, day out. And he says, yeah, I'm struggling. I'm dying. I have drank so much that my liver is now shutting down, and I don't have but a few years to live, if that at all. And I talked to him about that struggle. He invited me to come to his house one night, and sitting across from him at his dining room table, I said this to him, that God is willing to forgive everything in your past. He said, but Pastor, you don't know what I've done. I said, I don't care what you've done. God is willing to forgive everything in your past. But Pastor, I don't care what you've done. I'm not going to ask you what you've done. But God is in the forgiving business. That's what He does. Well, what do I have to do that? I said, nothing. Just accept it. It's called grace. You don't deserve it. You don't earn it. Here you are in the latter years of your life, and you know that you're dying, and you know that eternity is a questionable thing for you right now. And so you come to the place where you're struggling with this. And I had the privilege of there at his dining room table, helping him to understand that God loved him, forgave him, and invited him into the family. You know who didn't want him in the family? Everybody at church that had been in the family longer than he. A Sunday school class of men that would have nothing to do with him because he owed all of them money. They wouldn't let him come to the class. They wouldn't invite him to the class. They would gather in their pompous room with all of their big black Bibles, and they would talk about how God loves all people, but he was never invited because they didn't want him to be a part of the kingdom. He's the guy that came in at the 11th hour. And all of God's grace was given to him. Not a portion, not a little bit. The problem was that this man lost all of this time. And he would constantly say to me, if only I'd known earlier. If only I'd just known earlier. If only somebody would have told me this earlier, my life could have been different. I baptized him. He's a big man. One of my favorite baptisms ever. Because the water, when I put him under the water slushed up to the back of the baptistry, came rushing forward, went over the top of the front glass, and baptized the back row of the choir. Do you know who sat in the back row of the choir? That men's Sunday school class. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is not our place to determine who receives grace and when they receive it. It's our place to preach grace and to celebrate it. Listen to the character of this grace. We often grumble and are discontent because we think grace is based on fairness or it's based upon what other people deserve. Here is the only thing that grace is dependent upon. We're about to take a piece of bread and we're going to put it in our mouths and we're going to be reminded that Jesus lived. We're going to be reminded that his blood was shed so that it could cover our lives. And once that blood has been applied to our lives, just as it was in the Old Testament Passover story, when God looks at me, he sees the blood and he passes over me. Doesn't really matter what's in my past, doesn't even matter what's in my present, doesn't matter what's in my future. God's grace has covered all of that. Now there's a benefit to living that. There is a benefit in understanding that. There's a benefit of working in the laborer's field for more than an hour each day. There's something good about being involved in the kingdom's work. There's something good about being involved in what Christ does for us and how we can share that with other people. But if you wait till the 11th hour, it's still the same grace as those who began the journey a long time ago. The same grace that my grandmother received, and she lived for Jesus a long time, was the same grace that that man received in the 11th hour of his life. Aren't you thankful that the man in the field says, it's mine. Don't tell me how to do with what's mine. And isn't it amazing that when God gives his grace, he gives it from a loving spirit, and he gives it from a generous heart, and he overwhelms us with his grace. I know you've heard that song about it's like an ocean that's just kind of sweeping over us. Wow, that's big. I heard a story not long ago about a man's daughter who fell off of a cruise ship. And he jumped overboard to go to where she was. It takes that ship over an hour, maybe sometimes 2 hours, to make a complete turn to get back to where they were. They had sent out a lifeboat, and in that lifeboat they they were there in the middle of the ocean, just being overwhelmed. There's a father holding on to his daughter for dear life at that moment, thinking that maybe life is coming to an end. You look around and you see this big ship and it's leaving, and you're overwhelmed by the vastness of the ocean. And then out of that ocean, out of that moment in the darkness of that night, there was a hand reaching out from a lifeboat. Now, I would have been the captain of that boat and said some things like this. Well, what were they doing standing too close to the railing? Didn't they know? We put up signs. Shouldn't they have known not to fall overboard? Gee whiz, how stupid is that little girl? She surely should have known that why don't we just go on and leave her? She should have known better than to be climbing on that railing. And what's that father doing? Doesn't he know it's dangerous to jump overboard? Doesn't he know that it's dangerous to get in the ocean this time of night, in the vastness of this ocean? Doesn't he know that he could drown? It's his own decision making. Why don't we just go on? If God treated us as we deserved, the ship would have never come back to us. If God would have deserved us based on our judgment in life, the lifeboat would have never made its way to us. But in the vastness of that ocean, when it seemed like everything was overwhelming to us, out of that darkness reaches a hand that says, I'm going to give you the fullness of my grace. I'm going to give you the fullness of my forgiveness. And out of the depths of this ocean, I'm going to pull you out. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. Very deeply stained within. I was sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. And from what? From the waters lifted me. Now safe am I. That's God's grace. As we join here, I want to invite you to accept God's grace.